Welcome to Go Vote Omaha, presented by the League of Women Voters of Greater Omaha. I'm Barb Thompson, a League member, and your host for this day. Each program, we talk about important public policy issues. We hope you'll talk about those issues, and then at election time, you'll be ready and willing to go vote. Our conversation today is about climate change, the faith community's response, and resiliency in the face of what can seem overwhelming. Our featured guest today is Reverend Kim Morrow. Kim serves as Senior Associate at Veritas Group, a sustainability consulting company headquartered in Omaha, Nebraska. Her expertise includes sustainability master planning and implementation, climate resiliency, planning and sustainable behavior change program design. She also serves as an adjunct minister at First Plymouth Church and as a pastor at Contemplate Lincoln, an ecumenical Christian contemplative ministry. For her efforts on climate change with faith communities, Kim was honored at the White House in 2015 as a champion of change. In 2016 and 2018, she was named as one of Lincoln's most influential women by the Lincoln Journal-Star. Kim serves on boards of Nebraska Interfaith Power and Light and the Nature Conservancy of Nebraska. She is a member of the Mayor's Environmental Task Force in Lincoln, Nebraska, and she holds a Master of Divinity and has done doctoral studies in Christian spirituality. So welcome, Kim, and thank you for being here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
The interdenominational faith community was amongst the first responders to question the climate change, and many have published even statements regarding this. As a faith leader, why do you work on climate change?
Well, I had a really big wake-up call about 12 years ago when I saw a film that really laid out all the impacts of climate change. And it was the first time that I really understood the scope of the problem in its entirety. I was a newly ordained minister at the time, and I felt that I had taken a vow, so to speak, to protect people, to offer my life in service of people. And if this was going to be the biggest challenge facing my generation of humans on Earth, then I needed to do all I could to help people prepare and adapt to this catastrophe. So that's what I've been working on in different ways over the last 12 years or so. And I think also I'm called to do it because I see how much people are struggling with climate change, and we're seeing more and more of that these days. But people are beginning to feel a sense of despair oftentimes at the changes that they're seeing in the natural environment. And a lot of people don't know how to talk about that despair or where to talk about it. And I have found it to be extremely meaningful to create spaces for people to dialogue about that sense of grief and despair, and then by doing so to create spaces for new hope to sprout.
I can speak from personal experience. Having worked with different groups that I've had the pleasure to be on, and work hard to put forward ideas and try to see the growth of sustainability movement and those kinds of things. But to feel that sense of burnout, to feel that sense of is what I'm doing making a difference? How do you talk to folks and ask and give them hope in the face of that, to say you will make a difference, and to feel like the efforts that we do make on a daily basis can do that.
It's a tough challenge that we're in, because I think the terms of the game have changed. It's not the same kind of challenge as other challenges we've faced in recent history. It's much harder to solve, and it's much harder to give simple, reassuring answers. You can't really say everything's going to be okay, because it may not be. And I think that what's important, what I'm really shifting my lens to look at, is helping people to build resiliency, because we all need to be resilient to the changes that are coming, both personally and practically. And when we can increase our capacity to bounce back from disturbances and to continue to thrive in the midst of the kinds of challenges we're facing and going to face, that's when we can really take hold of a new sense of being in the world. And that's where our hope can come from.
You know, you've worked on climate change, you know, you said, 12 years ago you kind of had an awakening, and, how have you I would like you to talk about the conversation. How has that changed over time, and where would you say it stands now?
It's changed quite a bit since I've been doing this work. In the beginning, it was very much an issue that you didn't discuss in polite company, and it was very rarely brought up in meetings or in at the legislature, especially in Nebraska. Certainly wasn't brought up around the family dinner table very often, I don't think. And it was, especially in faith communities, it was something that they didn't want to touch with a 10-foot pole because it was too controversial. But now what has really changed is it's become much more of a household word. It's become something that everyone is talking about. It's becoming a concept that politicians across the board are talking about. There are so many more strategies to address it. The growth of renewable energy and the increasing affordability of wind and solar energy is one example that has made a lot of inroads, a lot of forward-looking possibilities. Electric vehicles is another area that has grown a lot. And so suddenly now, in fact, just earlier this week, I was at a candidate forum in Lincoln, where I live, and it was a whole candidate forum on sustainability and the environment. And there were 13 candidates, including mayoral and city council candidates, and they were all being posed questions about their positions on the environment, on sustainability, on climate resiliency. And I had a moment of just sitting back and thinking, wow, times have changed. There were 200 people who had shown up for this conversation in the community. It was great.
You've talked with me about working with different cities on resiliency programs, and what has been the difference there? Because I don't know that cities in the past were thinking about resiliency. Mm-hmm. They were thinking about recycling programs, largely, but maybe not resiliency insofar as climate change is now making us all adapt. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's an interesting shift. Cities have designed their infrastructure according to historic weather data. So they would design, a floodplain infrastructure, for example, for a 1% chance flood. Well, that's based on historic climate models of how often it has flooded in the last 30 years or 50 years, whatever the time span it was. But our climate is changing in such a dynamic way that those engineering calculations of the past are no longer always relevant to the conditions we're having in the present. So it is a real challenge for municipalities, and I think they're going to be challenged in a variety of ways in the future. We may be looking at needing to create cooling shelters for our populations to withstand ongoing high summer temperatures. We may be looking at reclassifying buildings that are in floodplains or that will be in floodplains of the future to protect our people. We may need to replace our stormwater management system to decrease the rate of flooding. We may need to put in a whole range of bioswales and rain gardens to absorb the heavy downpours that will be coming. So I think a lot of cities are beginning to look at how they can increase their resiliency in a multitude of ways. And I'll just add too, it's not just infrastructure, it's also social resiliency. And I've been working with a small community in South Dakota on a climate resiliency plan, and they have come up with some really innovative and interesting ways to strengthen their community in a really multifaceted way that really is going to create a stronger community all around, regardless of climate change. So it's really exciting to see them take hold of that vision.
Sure. I want to remind our viewers and our listeners that this is the League of Women Voters of Greater Omaha, with our guest today is Reverend Kim Morrow. So faith and spirituality, sometimes they're thought of as different things, but as someone who is spiritual but maybe doesn't identify to a particular denomination, I feel like I still have a stake in the faith. And so what do those things have to offer to people that are looking at climate change and wonder, what can I do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of people do see those two things as being separate, and I've gotten so many quizzical looks over the years that, how are you bringing these two things together? But the answer really lies in hope, I believe, and that's because all of the world's greatest faith traditions ultimately have a message of hope. And I think the biggest question facing humanity since the beginning of time has been, how do we understand suffering? How do we understand the meaning of our lives? And faith traditions have come up with really amazing answers to those questions. And so there are deep, deep resources of hope as an answer to despair in the world's faith traditions and in our spiritual practices as well. So to me, our faith traditions are amazing sources of wisdom for us. We have some amazing prophets, like Jesus has been an incredible prophet, and Buddha was an incredible prophet, and I'm still looking for prophets of today, those people who, one definition of a prophet is someone who stands on the edge of society and points the society toward a different future, kind of calls the society to understand what's going wrong now and points them to a new future. And so I'm finding a couple of those people, especially in the writings of Charles Eisenstein and Joanna Macy. There are two philosophers who are really pointing us to what you might call a new story of how we can be in a new world. They've been really helpful.
Right, so you talk about those new prophets, and can you talk a little bit more about maybe Charles Eisenstein? I had the opportunity to read through some of the things that he's putting out there, and the insight, you think these are things that seem so obvious, but until someone puts it in a framework of this is important to where we're going, and talking about a direction. You know, you and I talked a little bit about chaos and structure, and how important it is to find structure out of the chaos that sometimes we feel.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the most important things to grasp about this time in history is that we actually have a very unique opportunity to remake our world and our relationship to ourselves and to each other in the midst of this crisis. Because whether we like it or not, climate change is going to challenge the very foundations of how we operate as a society. And we're going to have to change those. And some might say that they needed changing anyway, because our society has led us to become rather distant from ourselves, from each other, from our bodies, from nature. And as Charles Eisenstein and others are saying, we have the opportunity now to heal those breakages and to come back together to become more whole individuals and a more whole society.
You mentioned to me off camera that you have a seminar coming up that you're working with on the principles of Joanna Macy, and maybe you can talk a little bit about that. I know it's one that's coming up, and that you might do others in the future. So I think our listeners or our watchers might be very interested to hear about that.
Yeah, I've joined together with a small group of women, and we are starting to lead retreats based on the work of Joanna Macy. And the retreat we're leading next week is called The Work That Reconnects, Moving from Despair to Empowerment in the Age of Planetary Distress. And what we do is we bring a small group of people together, and we do a lot of experiential exercises to give people those spaces to voice their sense of despair or their feelings about the environment and about the world today. And then we do some exercises to help them connect with a deeper sense of themselves, their past, and their future in a very large time scale, looking at 7 generations into the past and into the future, to help us understand more what our role is, our unique role is at this time in history, and the unique contribution that we can make to our descendants 7 generations into the future. And these have been really, really special conversations, and I hope to do more of them in the future.
Talk about your experience, because I thought it was very enlightening for me when I read your description in an article that you'd written. But talking about the person who sat across from you and said, I'm from the future, and I'd like to know what it is that you've done that is going to secure my future, where I am right now.
Yeah, it was a role-playing exercise, and there was a woman who sat down next to me, and she played this role of a quote-unquote future being, and she asked me a series of questions, and I had to answer. And so first she asked me what it was like to live at this time in history, and that was a really painful question to answer. And then she asked me, what did you do to contribute to a more healthy and sustainable world? And I felt like a sense of speechlessness, like how could I possibly answer her? Like, what did I do? I felt such a sense of responsibility to want to give her a better future that it made me call forth the answer from deep in myself. And as I answered her, I also felt a renewed commitment to continue to be responsible to her, to this future being, and to really use my gifts to help contribute to a healthy and more sustainable world. And I don't have any illusions that we're going to create a more beautiful and perfect world for everyone all around the globe. I think it's going to be a very textured and very multivalent future, but I do believe that I can contribute to a through line of health and sustainability and justice and truth. And I decided in that moment that that is my commitment in this life, and I won't give up on that, and that is also the source of my hope.
Climate justice was something that you and I have talked about in the past when the Pope put out Laudato Si, and talking about climate justice and how important that was when you talk about how climate is going to impact not just everybody, but the people who are most affected, of course, are those that are least capable of affecting it. And that was a big deal. And then we have the Paris climate talks, and we have things that we've had those moments of up and down and up and down. But through this, I feel like I've seen the faith community be consistent. And you can go to the denominations, and almost every one of them has a statement about sustainability, about our responsibility to the earth. And I think that's very encouraging.
Absolutely. The faith traditions have done an amazing job getting on board and being that moral conscience in this issue. And organizations like Interfaith Power and Light is a national organization with a chapter in Nebraska, and they lobby our elected officials, and they put out action pieces to their members, calling us to understand the ethical dimensions of this issue. So as you said, there are inequity issues on a global and local scale that are important and need to be addressed. And there are also ethical issues in terms of our relationship to other living beings. That's an aspect that has been less explored so far, but they're fascinating ethical questions to ask, what is our responsibility to other species? Or from a conservation perspective, if we are going to protect certain species or certain habitats, how do we choose which ones to protect? It's a terrible question to ask, but in conservation circles, sometimes those conversations have to be had.
So we'll talk about the elephant in the room. At the time of this taping, for the League of Women Voters with Reverend Kim Morrow, at the time of this taping, we're in Nebraska, in the Midwest. We're in the middle of crisis management. With the floods in the Midwest, and we have the cyclone bomb. Mozambique is recovering from Typhoon Idai, and the climate change issue has changed from it being, why is it happening, to it's happening and how do we respond to it? We've, in Nebraska alone, it's catastrophic, and it is, the costs that are going to be felt are going to be long into the future. And this is not just in dollars, but in human lives, in the livestock lost, in people's livelihoods, in people's lifestyles. What can the faith community do, in these situations where we are looking at crisis? Because I think you are going to be looking at a lot of despair right now, and
Yeah.
it's certainly understandable.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the faith community has an important role to play here as well. On the one level of disaster relief, of course, I think we're going to be seeing faith communities around the state play a really important role in helping to offer relief now in this emergency stage, but also as we move forward into the rebuilding stage. Churches can also be important community centers where supplies can be distributed or people can come for pastoral care and community support. And then moving forward, I think that churches and ministers and people of faith can create those safe spaces for people to come to voice what is on their minds and heart, to help provide them resources. We're going to have a lot of people who are facing some really desperate circumstances, economically and otherwise, and they need to be heard, they need to be supported, and they need to be helped to find the next path forward on their journey.
Yeah, it feels as much as climate change is no longer, it's really transitioning from a political one to one that is an us problem.
Absolutely.
Because we are the ones who are experiencing it.
Yeah, it's a humanitarian problem. And that may be one of the silver linings in this disaster. I think we've been fortunate in Nebraska so far that we haven't had a lot of climate impacts. And maybe we had the luxury of thinking that climate change was something that was happening somewhere else. And we don't have that luxury anymore. So it may create a lot more urgency in our political process, and that would be a good thing.
Right, I think Nebraska is behind the curve on creating a climate resiliency plan from the legislative and governor's office. So those are maybe some things that we'll see the conversation start. And you certainly will have, I would think, people saying, yes, we need something because we can't do this again.
Right.
You know, or we don't want to do this again.
Right.
I would guess I would give you the opportunity to, you know, as we come to the end, you know, toward the end of this, what are you wanting people to know? What are the messages that you'd like to have people take away from this?
Well, I think, you know, people always want to know what they can do, what practical, physical things they can do, and I get in a lot of conversations about recycling. You mentioned recycling earlier, and I do work on recycling issues in my work all the time, and it's important, but I really would like people to move beyond recycling. There are a range of things that individuals can do to reduce their carbon footprint, and I would encourage anyone to Google carbon footprint calculator online if you'd like to take one and identify some measures that you can take on in your personal life. But I would also encourage people to really contemplate how they might have a change of mind and heart, as well as a change in their outward behaviors, and to look at where there might be opportunities in your community to love better, to care for people better, to strengthen your community, to think about how to make your community more resilient, not just so that you can survive the next natural disaster, but so that your community can thrive into the future.
For the folks who are watching on the video, there will be a list of some resource options where they can go and possibly learn more and maybe find a way to take some action that they can do. So Nebraska Interfaith Power and Light being one of those. Do you want to talk about a couple of the others real quick? Or?
Yeah, there's a website called Daily Good that I have a URL for, and they're a great organization that is seeking to spread goodness and kindness and positivity in the world, and they have a wonderful email newsletter that you can sign up for in this age where we're hearing so much bad news. They really put out stories of hope and stories of community strength. So that's one, and then we also recommend the work of Joanna Macy and Charles Eisenstein for people, and the work of the Nebraska Nature Conservancy also is doing really wonderful work.
Sure. Kim, this has been, a real pleasure for me to be able to sit down and talk with you on a topic that I think is really important, and it is, when I started into this probably 10 years ago, and I went in as more of a gee, what can I do? And I'm happy about this, and I'm excited. And it is really, as you said, the conversation has changed so much since we first started. And changing it from, the low-hanging fruit of recycling to the decisions that we made, procurement conversations, or, what kind of business decisions are you making?
Right.
Are they ones that impact the community in a positive way, as opposed to one that doesn't, necessarily lend itself to the future? So
Yeah.
thank you so much for being on the show.
My pleasure.
If I could take one thing away from, the time that I've spent with you, would be the sense of hope.
Oh, good.
As someone who believes strongly in the power of human beings, that we can affect change. And it's to know that if you can walk that direction, that together we can make it happen. And I know that sounds a little bit trite and maybe a little bit Pollyanna, but it's true.
Yeah, it's true. Humans are capable of some amazing things, and sometimes it takes a crisis to bring out what we're really capable of.
Sure.
I would just make one last addition. If listeners are interested in having a speaker come speak to your faith community, if you are part of a faith community, please contact Nebraska Interfaith Power and Light. I think we had the URL, but it's nebraskaipl.org. We'd be happy to connect with other faith communities in the state.
Terrific. Well, for the League of Women Voters, I'm Barb Thompson, reminding you to inform yourself about the issues, and at election time, go vote, Omaha. It's important.